I could have translated that in any of three ways. It does mean to remember, but it also means to touch something or to know something with absolute assurity. So if I am to remember the gods, or I'm going to remember my grandfather who has passed on, I could just as easily say, I feel my grandfather. I feel God. I know God. I know my grandfather with absolute assurity. It's much more powerful than saying remembered.
On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn and discover how speaking with people of other faiths can strengthen our own faith and even our own practice. We've all heard about the power of the written word, but we're surrounded by so much printed material that I think we take it for granted it will always be there. But try and imagine what it would be like if a group of people were able to destroy every copy of whatever text you hold sacred. So, no Quran, no Torah, no Bible at all. Can you imagine how desperate you might be to share the stories and the wisdom that you remember of what had been most meaningful to you with your children or your neighbors or friends? Today, our guest, Alan Christenson, has helped restore the sacred text of the Maya to the Maya. Alan Christenson is a professor in the Department of Humanities, Classics, and Comparative Literature at Brigham Young University. He's the translator of Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya. He completed a PhD in Pre-Columbian Art History at the University of Texas, Austin, and he's worked as an ethnographer and linguist in highland Guatemala since 1978 with two particular Maya language groups. I asked Alan why he wanted a volume with both K'iché and English included.
For many years, including the fairly recent Civil War, it was dangerous to teach your children indigenous languages, dress in indigenous clothing, and certainly to study books like the Popol Vuh. It includes not only the original 16th century version, but also an updated version that can be read today by the K'ichés. And as far as needing another English translation, there are several. I never criticize anyone that takes on a task as monumental as translating an ancient text, but some of the translators are kind of dictionary translations and don't really get the grammar properly and don't spend the time to go to 16th century dictionaries and grammars to find the original meanings.
And something fascinating to me, not speaking K'iché', is that as I'm reading through, just the number of footnotes that will explain context.
Way too many.
So that something that I might have thought, well, okay, whatever, I just read that. But now I think, oh, now I know what it means because of the background and the situation that a native speaker might know or someone in the culture. Was that an important part too?
That was an essential part, especially for an ancient text for a non-Western language. Translation is an art. There are a number of ways that you can translate a particular passage, and there's never a one-to-one correspondence from a K'iché' word to an English word. So there's always nuances, there are always subtle alternative meanings, and unless you have a footnote to kind of describe those, you really can't get the full meaning.
Meaning. I want to focus on that for just a second. I was really quite moved when you are talking about that you're telling a group of indigenous people that you have been translating this, and they ask you to read it, and the feeling that comes over them and your realization. And I'd like to ask you to read a little bit of what you started with and then your reaction.
Just as a background, the reason why I was doing that, I was working on a dictionary and grammar in the K'iché' language in 1978. It was way out in the middle of nowhere, and it's about an hour and a half hike back to where I was staying. And so I took a shortcut straight down the mountain, and I came into a village that I had never seen before, and there was a group there that invited me over, and we had a nice conversation. And they don't have a really good word for dictionary or, writing language, because at this point, sadly, it's not a written language. It had been thousands of years in the past, but it had been pretty well suppressed. And so they asked me what I was doing there, and I described it as gathering the words of their people. And so I just read some of the words. Well, this is how you say dog, tse, and this is how you write mother, nan, and they were fascinated. And I said, well, your own people, up until 200 generations before, could read and write. I'm working on a book that was written by your people. And they just asked me if I would read some of it. So in the original language, it reads, Areuts ichoshik wae, k'ak tseninok, k'achamamok, ak loninik katolana puchupakach waek utane nabetzich nabeuchan. And the way that reads in English, it's much more beautiful in the original K'iché'. This is the account of when all is still silent and placid. All is silent and calm. Hushed and empty is the womb of the sky. These then are the first words, the first speech. There is not yet one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, or forest. All alone the sky exists. The face of the earth has not yet appeared. Alone lies the expanse of the sea along with the womb of all the sky. There is not yet anything gathered together, for all is at rest, nothing stirs. All is languid at rest in the sky. There is not yet anything standing erect, only the expanse of the water. Only the tranquil sea lies alone. There is not yet anything that might exist, for all lies placid and silent in the darkness, in the night. So while I'm reading this, actually it got late enough that the stars were coming out, it was dark, and they were all looking up at the sky because they believed that the world of the ancestors or the other world actually rotates up above them at night so that you can see the ancestors in the sky. And I didn't want to interrupt them, so they just kind of looked at the sky for a while, and finally one of them asked me, so these are the words of our ancestors? And I said, yes. How long ago? They think in terms of generations, so between 200 and 300 generations. And he said, Dimj kashol shin ocher katat kanan yak astachinakchik. Great among us are our ancestors, our mothers and our fathers today, because you have resurrected them. And I always thought that was a beautiful way of looking at reading the words of someone. In K'iché' worldview, if you read the words of someone that's passed, you bring them forth in your blood, and they think of it as materially present, that they're actually there. So they're very careful about quoting the words of those who have passed on. But this was a very powerful thing for them that, yes, their ancestors can speak again. I think that's the way we should look at all great literature and think.
Yeah, it made me think, how can I go back to literature or scripture that's very valuable to me and experience it in that same way?
Yeah. I mean, it's literally raising them from the dust.
But you say somewhere in the book, and I was really struck by it, this is not for me. This is for them. Will you talk about that?
I had a graduate advisor back at the University of Texas that was the world authority, in fact, of lowland Maya people and their art and literature. And one of the last conferences that she went to, she said, I've devoted my life to hearing the words that the ancient Maya had for me. And I've only now come to realize that they weren't speaking to me. But what a privilege it is to look over the shoulders of the descendants of the Maya and hear what she found to be incredibly profound and beautiful. And I agree. That's the way I look at it as well. These are meant far more for the Maya than they are for outside academics like me.
I'll just follow up there on a non-academic level. So when you see people who are the descendants of these people hearing or learning to read these words for the first time, what effect does it have on them? What do you see happening?
Well, especially in the context of Guatemala, there was a civil war, sadly, that kind of ended in the 1990s. And much of my work in Guatemala was during the Civil War. And sadly, there were groups that want to suppress Maya culture and language, and you could be disappeared for naming your child with a Maya name or dressing in indigenous clothing.
That is so recent.
And that's very recent, and sadly, there are still factions that believe that. So it was very dangerous, and I've lost a lot of very good friends and colleagues during that war. But you can see the resilience of a people that have been suppressed and oppressed since the early 1500s, and yet they are resilient people. They fight for their culture, for their beliefs, their worldview. They teach their children, whether it's legal or not, these things. And so now, when it's a little bit more open and people can actually teach their children in schools in indigenous languages, there are now indigenous newspapers and radio stations. It's such a blessing to see the pride in their eyes that we are able to speak openly about our ancestors and have an admiration for their incredibly beautiful literature, their art, everything about their culture.
There is a complexity to it that belies any thought of primitive religion. I mean, just to look at the glyphs and think what it would take to learn these.
Welcome to my world.
And to carve them. Yes, which you've done, so you can speak of it. If someone says to you, what is this book or this codex? How do you describe it in a few sentences? Can it be done?
Yes, but you kind of have to understand that the Maya are not a minor culture. Arguably, they're the world's oldest people. Maya have maintained their language, their core beliefs, their worldview, much of their rituals and ceremonies since at least 2000 BC. There have only been 5 independently invented written languages that are phonetic in the history of the world. Maya is one of the 5. The K'iché' kingdom was in the highlands of Guatemala in the early 1500s, and they were the dominant kingdom in the highlands. When the Spaniards came through in 1524, they killed the K'iché' kings. There were 2 of them. They had different roles, but they were twin kings. They hanged them until they were almost dead and then burned them alive. They burned the capital city. They enslaved and massacred tens of thousands of people. So this is a trauma that still the K'iché' people feel. And yet out of that, there were survivors of that conquest that could read and write and preserve the contents of what they considered their most valuable, precious book.
Boy, there's so much in a book like this to dig into. Are there a couple of moments that maybe our favorite stories or favorite concepts or teachings or advice that you see playing out in the lives of people today?
Yeah, among traditionalist K'iché'-Maya, they have maintained ceremonies that date back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they all are connected with, in some way, either creation or rebirth. And one of the passages that appears in the early pages of the book describes the gods creating the earth. And the way they say it, then came his word, heart of sky arrived here with sovereign and Quetzal serpent in the darkness and the night. He spoke with sovereign and Quetzal serpent. They talked together then. They thought and they pondered. They reached an accord, bringing together their words and their thoughts. Then they gave birth, heartening one another. Beneath the light, they gave birth to humanity. They arranged for the germination and creation of the trees and the bushes, the germination of all life and creation, in the darkness and in the night, by Heart of Sky, who is called Huracan. What's really interesting about that is where it says the gods came together and they reached an accord, bringing together their words and their thoughts. Every major ceremony I've ever been in, the person who arranges the ceremony will always say, we have come together to bring together our thoughts and our minds. Directly quoted out of the Popol Vuh. They don't know that, but it's been handed down from generation to generation. Nothing can succeed unless people are of one heart, one mind, one thought.
I was quite moved by Hunahpu and Xbalanque. I hope I got close.
Xbalanque, yeah.
Xbalanque.
Close enough.
So the twins, who are the younger brothers of some of the older ones, and they're mistreated. Even their own grandmother is not very pleased with them. And yet there's this line that I was so impressed with when they realized they were not loved by their grandmother, nor by one Bats or one Chuan.
They're older brothers, yeah.
Nor were they given any food. When meals were prepared for them, these older brothers would eat it all before they returned. And here's the line. But they did not become enraged or angry. They tolerated it, for they knew their own nature, and this was a light by which they could see. I just really had to stop and think about that they weren't reacting or seeking revenge immediately. Some does happen later. But they just accept all of this because they knew something about themselves. That's really quite moving to me, that just applies to humanity in general, if we have some idea of who we are as humans, but even spiritually.
Yeah. There are people that are very tied to place, and they have a beautiful expression that when a newcomer comes into a community, they give them a few months to kind of be left alone. And the first words that are usually given is, have you found yourself yet? I think that's a beautiful way of looking at
Interesting.
it. Yeah. And I think it ties into that idea that to know who you are and know what your place is in the universe is probably the most difficult question, but it's the most important question.
There are a lot of stories in scriptures about dysfunctional families. These 2 twins, though, that are kind of at the heart of this sacred writing, they seem very unified. And I just wonder if that strikes you as unusual or purposeful.
The Maya are kind of fascinating in the way that they look at the world. It's very different from the way that we do. Pretty much all cultures kind of understand that there's opposition in the world. But for most Western cultures, ours included, we tend to think of there's a God and there's a devil, and that they are in opposition and antagonistic opposition. The Maya don't look at it that way. They also recognize that everything has its opposite, but they see it as complementary opposites.
And necessary?
And necessary. So you can't have life without death. So you don't blame death. Death is not bad. It's the means by which we transition to another rebirth. But that's true of sunset and sunrise. It's true of the harvest of the maize. It's true of everything. That one flows naturally into the other. So you'll notice that in the Popol Vuh, there are a lot of twins. It's not just their parents are twins. The death itself is a twin deity. Their kings are twin deities. And this is the way that you should look at it. It's almost like a very powerful form of marriage. That, marriage is a marriage of opposites, but they're complementary opposites. Mm-hmm. Each completes the other. So think of it as a circle, that the two different sides of the circle are part of the same circle, and they flow naturally into one another, but they're opposite in nature.
Now, I can't let you go without asking about the ball courts and the importance of this. And we've spoken with a woman who is Maya. She talks about that idea of the game still being very much alive. What do you think that represents? I mean, it could represent many things, but as you go through and in your translation process, first of all, it seemed very unfortunate that the ball court was placed right above the underworld and seemed to, anytime someone was there, disturb the gods, and then they would get a summons, and often that was the end of them. But what does that mean or represent to you?
Well, it's a metaphor. I'm sure that people played the ball game for fun, and there are certainly ball courts in every Maya community. But there are ceremonial ball games, and that is much more important. So in the text, it talks about how the twins, both sets of twins, go down into the other world, and they confront the lords of death and disease in a ball court specifically. The word for ball court and the word for tomb is the same, home. You're going down into the underworld, literally the place of the fleshless, of the dead, and you're confronting the lords of death there. It's a game, but it's a game for keeps, and it's a rigged game. Everyone dies, so obviously they're going to win. But what is wonderful about the Popol Vuh, it's trying to explain how it is that death can result in a rebirth. How is it that you can take a grain of maize, and the word that they use for a grain of maize is little skull, because it's dry and it's dead. Yeah. It doesn't look like there's any life to it whatsoever. You bury it in the ground, just like you do your parents and your grandparents when they pass away, and somehow it's reborn out of there. This is an attempt to try to describe the confrontation of life versus death, and it's an eternal confrontation that's constantly going on. Again, complementary opposition, but what the hero twins were able to do is to not defeat the lords of death, because you can't do that. You trick them. And they trick them in such a way that the dead kill themselves, which allows life to be reborn.
Well, Alan, would you pick out a section or two or story or two to tell us that have been meaningful to you in the translation process or in life?
Sure. This is kind of lovely, the way that the Maya look at their relationship to their ancestors and to deities. You have to understand in K'iché' way of looking at things, gods are not all-powerful and they're not all omniscient and perfect. They make mistakes. They're born, they live, they die. The whole point of the creation is to create human beings who will be mediators, that will have one foot in this world and one foot in the other world and maintain the balance and to rebirth the world. So this is why all ceremonies have to do with either creation or rebirth. They believe that when they are in a creation ceremony, that time folds back on itself, and they're literally at the time of creation. It's not a reenactment. It is the creation for them. And this is how the gods are able to continue to support us and give us rain, give us the sun. Gods aren't the way we think of as gods. The sun is a god, but it's the sun. Maize is a god, but it's not just a maize cob with a halo and wings. It's maize. So it's a very immanent religion where you hold gods, you love gods. Gods are constantly there with you. And we depend on those gods, but the gods also depend on us. And so this passage from the creation of the first group of human beings that didn't work out very well, The god said, "It shall be found, it shall be discovered how we are to create shaped and framed people who will be providers and sustainers for us. May we be called upon and may we be remembered. For it is with words that we are sustained, O midwife and patriarch, our grandmother and our grandfather, Ishpiakok and Ishmukane, these are gods. Thus may it be spoken, may it be sown, may it dawn so that we are called upon and supported, so that we are remembered by framed and shaped people, by effigies and forms of people. Hearken and let it be so." The main word in there is remembered. And in K'iché', the word is very short, na, N-A with a little glottal on the other. Na. Na means three things. This is, again, going back to translation. I could have translated that in any of three ways. It does mean to remember, but it also means to touch something or to know something with absolute assurity. So if I am to remember the gods, or I'm going to remember my grandfather who has passed on, I could just as easily say, I feel my grandfather. I feel God. I know God. I know my grandfather with absolute assurity. It's much more powerful than saying remembered.
You've mentioned a couple of kinds of ceremonies, including a creation, recreation, creation, rebirthing. Is that a seasonal thing, or is that something that happens many times during the course of a year? Or
depends on the ceremony. The really big ones are once a year. So think of everything in terms of a circle. There is no beginning and there's no end. It's a constant revolution. And so with the cyclic nature of the universe, they don't think of the calendar year as ending. They think of it as in terms of completion. They've reached the beginning again. There was this big thing about the Maya said that the world is going to end in 2012 because that was the end of their long count calendar. So I was in Guatemala and hanging out with my friends in 2012, and there was a fairly high level priest that was a good friend of mine, and he said, "What is it with you gringos that you think the world is going to end with the calendar?" And I said, "Well, yeah, some people don't really understand how the Maya calendar works, and they think that the world is going to die in 2012. That's the best way of saying it in K'iché'. And he says, "Well, of course it will." I was kind of taken aback. "Really? It's going to die?" He says, "Yeah. World dies all the time. Every time the sun sets, the world dies. Every time it's January 1st, the world dies. Every Easter, Holy Week is a very big thing for the K'iché'. The world dies. But don't worry about it because we'll get it going again." And that is the purpose of their ceremonialism. It ties into that passage, that because we remember, then we can get dying things reborn again.
That's actually quite hopeful, but also really informative to me. I remember speaking with Hare Krishna adherent about the Vedas and Bhagavad Gita. And I was talking about, is it true? Is it not true? Is it literal? Is it not literal? And he was a little puzzled. He said, "I get what you're saying. Those aren't the questions we ask."
Right.
He said, maybe in some cycle of the world, it was exactly like this. And maybe in the multiple universes that are going on around us. And I thought, wow, my brain had to just open new doors to rooms I didn't know they were there to contemplate a new vision of even time and existence. And that's certainly what you've had to try and capture while translating.
Well, that's the difficulty, but it's also the blessing of being able to look through another person's eyes and at least get a small glimpse of the way that they look at the world.
Is there a daily worship practice or something like prayer? Or in the time before many of the copies of this book were destroyed, were there readings or group readings or individual? What do we know about that?
For daily practice and worship, it's rather beautiful. Only women can cook food. No self-respecting Maya would ever have a meal without maize. They are maize people. And to rebirth their bodies and everything about them, they have to have maize at every meal. So the woman will get up before dawn, in other words, the pre-creation time. She'll kindle a fire in a 3-stone hearth, which is for them the center of creation, 3 mountains surrounding a place where first fire is kindled. And then they will place their maize to be cooked, and she'll take that maize and she'll grind it on a grinding stone, turn it into tortillas or tamalitos, or there's 100 different things you can do with maize. And that becomes the flesh of her family. And so powerful is that as a female power, because only females can create flesh, that even the grinding stone that she uses is specifically woman power. So we say, what kind of worship they do? Every meal is a sacrament. I had a friend of mine that we were out working in his field, and he said, "Did you ever notice that the Roman Catholics on Sunday, that they have the host and they eat what they consider to be the flesh of God?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, they only do that once a week, don't they?" For most people, yeah, probably. We do it 3 times a day. Kind of like, this is a ceremony.
Yeah, just the preparation of your sustenance to stay alive. What should I ask you about this that I don't even know to ask because I'm so new to this and just learning from reading and learning even more from your explanations and now looking at footnotes? What do you wish people knew about this? What impressed upon you?
I think how powerful they see themselves. The highest deity, the creator deity, is the maize deity. And again, it's not an angelic or godlike presence. It's maize. It's a completely domesticated crop. And so you have to plant it. You have to cultivate it. You have to give it water. You have to build up ground around it to support it because maize is way too tall for its root system. You're constantly tending it and loving it. And I remember I was doing that dictionary project, and I was working with a young couple that were particularly good at medicinal plants. And we were getting into it. This plant is called this, and it's good for this and that and the rest of it. And I was speaking to the husband and the wife because in their priesthood, you have to be married. It has to have a female and a male component to it. And while she was talking, she was grinding the evening meal on a grindstone with the maize on a dirt floor in a thatch roof hut in the middle of nowhere. It's just so beautiful. And she had a little over a year-old little girl. And the little girl, unbeknownst to her, had reached into the pot of soaked maize ready to be ground and had gotten a fistful of it and was playing with it, and some of the grains were falling onto the ground. And after a few minutes, she noticed what had happened, and she immediately stopped the conversation. And she picked up her little girl and sat her on her lap, and she took the maize from her hand and one by one put it back into the pot. And then she picked up one by one each of the grains that had fallen onto the ground and cleansed it of every little speck of dust, and she kissed it, and she apologized for the disrespect that had been given to it. And by the end of it, by the last one she was putting in, she was crying and I was crying. Everybody was crying. It was just so beautiful to show that such a little thing like that isn't a little thing. It's life itself. And the fact that you can look at yourself and your little girl and others as being made of something sacred and something very ancient and something that can't be destroyed, but also has to be treated with dignity and respect. I think that's a wonderful way of looking at the world and looking at our fellow human beings.
Many thanks to Alan Christenson for speaking with me. Next week, we have a bonus discussion with Manuela Tzep de Hoja, who's a Mayan woman from Guatemala, and what the Popol Vuh means to her. So be sure and subscribe on Apple or Spotify in order to hear that episode for podcast listeners only. This episode was produced by Heather Bigley. Our production team also includes Aaliyah Alexander, Heidi Hansen, Ocean Marshall, and James Sturdivant. Our post-production sound designers are Mark Hansen, Lauren Sandberg, and DJ Crow Marty. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. In fact, we think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. Find us on Instagram and Facebook at In Good Faith Podcast. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel for extended interviews. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join me again soon, right here in Good Faith. Hi, Stephen Cap Perry here, host of In Good Faith. Here's another podcast from our BYU Radio family of podcasts I hope you'll check out. What I love is real. You know that saying, real recognize real? That's Lisa on The Lisa Show. Lisa Valentine Clark is a comedian. She's a believer, a single mother. And on The Lisa Show podcast, you'll hear from the Council of Moms, a genius idea, which is actually one of my favorite parts of her show. And you'll hear about the challenges of life, parenting, mental health questions, social issues. Yes, you'll hear from experts, but also from people discussing their where the rubber meets the road life experience. It's The Lisa Show, wherever you get your podcasts.